Chapter 11. Trial and Imprisonment. During the period of my trial, which must have taken about a week altogether, I was remanded in custody. At least I was able to meet my companions and discuss our common problems. But the thing that I objected to most of all was the constant interruption of being dragged backwards and forwards to the courtroom. Some of the undisciplined warders made conditions worse by their obvious delight in having so many prominent people to bully and push around. They had never before had to deal with so many political lawbreakers and were reveling in this chance to display authority. I was quite resigned to my fate. I had foreseen what in all probability lay in store for me, and I had prepared myself to accept the consequences. It was all a part of the struggle that I had embarked upon. It was a nuisance, of course, because it meant delay in achieving the final goal of freedom. But I would be able to pick up the threads where I had left off just as soon as I had served my sentence. I had long since come to learn that in the colonial struggle, when faced with a situation of this sort, it is not a question of justice. The idea of defending my case, therefore, had never entered my head. For whatever defense was put up, I felt that the authorities would not allow me and my colleagues to escape conviction, for the judiciary and the executive under a colonial regime are one and the same. Some of my followers, however, who were unacquainted with the treatment meted out to promoters of uprisings in a revolutionary movement, pressed me to secure the services of a lawyer to defend us. Although I knew that this was going to be a complete waste of money and energy, I did not want my colleagues to feel during the long months that lay ahead of us that we had put up no legal fight. I felt that even if we failed, the fact that we had tried might make them feel happier while undergoing their sentences. An African lawyer was out of the question, and so I arranged for 2 barristers to come out from England. These 2 gentlemen did everything they possibly could to help us, but I think that even they must have known how useless it was from the very beginning to battle against so determined a power. Our defence cost £2,000 altogether, and I had to get various loans in order to settle the amount. I was quite prepared for a prison sentence, but horrified by the rumour of a very different punishment in store for me. According to this report, someone in authority had conceived the ingenious idea that, as it had been impossible to pin the murder of the 2 African policemen killed during the clash with the ex-servicemen on any individual, and because I was responsible for declaring positive action, then I should be linked with the deaths of these 2 unfortunate men. It would have suited many people to have me out of the way for all time, but as my hands were perfectly clean with regard to this incident, their investigations proved quite fruitless, and the charge was never levelled against me. I appeared in the courtroom to defend the various charges against me, the main one being that I had incited others to take part in an illegal strike under the terms of positive action, which, in the opinion of the presiding magistrate, was a different matter to organizing a strike in furtherance of a trade dispute. What I had done, I was informed, was to endeavour to coerce the government of the Gold Coast. Mr. Salloway was there as one of the chief witnesses for the Crown. I sat and listened to the long story of my activities, of my warnings from the Colonial Secretary, and of my determination to go ahead with my plan in spite of these warnings. My defence could hardly have been called such, for, apart from denying the charge that I had anything to do with the strikes of the TUC and the meteorological workers, and explaining my campaign from my own standpoint and that of the Gold Coast people, I admitted that the facts they had recited were fairly accurate in record of what had taken place. I was given 2 sentences of 1 year each, but they had not finished with me. From Accra, I had to go on to Cape Coast to undergo trial for sedition as publisher of the Daily Mail, in which an article which had appeared called A Campaign of Lies, and for which my editor, Kofi Barker, was already imprisoned. I had forgotten for the moment that I was now a guest of His Majesty's prisons, and I was rather looking forward to this trip to Cape Coast in, I thought, a reasonably comfortable car. I soon discovered how wrong I was. To begin with, although I put up not the slightest resistance, my warders were apparently not going to take any chances of losing me, for I was promptly handcuffed. Then, with both hands clamped together at the wrists, I was made to climb into the back of an old van, a fate which would have put many experienced acrobats to shame. One look at the van dispelled any thought I may have had about a comfortable trip. Comfort was the least of my concerns now. The question uppermost in my mind was, how could a decrepit vehicle possibly make the journey in one piece? I soon stopped worrying about the vehicle, however, for it became increasingly apparent with every yard that we progressed that the odds against me arriving at my destination in one piece were far heavier. For 3 hours I was perched sideways on a hard bench, clasping awkwardly with my shackled hands a bar that was placed in the middle of the van. The body of the vehicle with which I was most actively concerned rocked and rolled as if it was a light raft on a stormy sea, and by shutting my eyes I could visualize myself as a galley slave. Every time we turned a corner, and I had no idea before that there was so many on the road to Cape Coast, every muscle of my body was brought into play in an effort to keep me from being thrown to the other side of the van. And this was not all. Every species of insect life that could fly, tickle and bite was represented in that van, and it took no time at all for them to discover my inability to knock them off the exposed parts of my body. I think the warders must have felt a little sorry for me, because somewhere along the route the van stopped and one of them brought me a bar of chocolate. As I had refused to eat anything before I left the car, I was very thankful for it, and I felt considerably happy as a result of the man's kind gesture. A solemn crowd of tearful people had assembled around the prison entrance at Cape Coast, and the sight of them touched me deeply. As soon as the van drew up, I performed another acrobatic feat, as I got out and was then bustled off to a cell. There, wrapped up in a blanket on the floor, completely left to myself, I had the deepest and soundest sleep that I had had for many nights. The following morning, I appeared before the court, defended by Archie Casely Hayford, now Minister of Communications. But here again, the defense might just as well have saved its breath, for it was all in vain. I was given another sentence of a year's imprisonment, making 3 years in all, each sentence to be served consecutively. As soon as the trial was over, I was given another nightmare ride back to Accra, where I was safely handed over to the authorities of James Fort Prison. I was taken to cell number 11, where 10 of my comrades were already installed, and I can't say that the prospect of a 3 years stay in these surroundings were a very happy one. Whilst I didn't exactly expect to be made to feel at home in James Fort, it was somewhat a shock to me to discover that as a political prisoner, I was treated as a criminal. Sometimes I used to speculate as to what my lot would have been as a hardened gallbird. It was difficult to imagine that there could be worse treatment if the minimum of health and sanity of the inmate were to be preserved. For 11 men, we were supplied with a bucket in one corner of the already overcrowded cell to serve as a latrine. After a few weeks, most of us managed to overcome the fearful indignity of using this so-called very public convenience. If only we had been permitted the flimsiest of straw mats to partition the thing off, it would have been at least an attempt to preserve a sense of decency, but it seemed that like animals in a cage, we had to act our part without complaint. We used to take it in turns to clean this receptacle each day, and we did what we could to make the best of a bad job. But it was most unpleasant, especially as the wretched food that we had was invariably upsetting our stomachs. It was all most embarrassing and most degrading. The food was both scanty and poor. For breakfast we were given a cup of maize porridge without sugar. For midday meal and for the last meal of the day at 4 p.m. we were given either boiled cassava, kenke, which is cornmeal, or gari, a cassava farine with red pepper. On Sundays and Wednesdays we had a watery soup with the minutest piece of meat thrown in. This was purely a gesture, for it was as hard as a bullet. Sometimes we would get a piece of smoked fish with a pepper. Rice was a luxury and only given to those who were unwell and for whom it was prescribed by the prison doctor. When we first arrived, my colleagues were so disgusted with the food that some of them went on a hunger strike. I was against this, for I saw that it would get us nowhere. On the contrary, it was necessary to eat all we could in an effort to keep our strength up. There was much work to do when we were eventually released, and it was going to be no good if anybody it was going to be no good to anybody if we had to be invalidated out. After much persuasion on my part, the strikers gave in. I used to fast for 1 or 2 days a week because this had been a former habit of mine. But apart from the spiritual value derived from this, during those prison days it also helped my stomach to right itself again. I had never cared much for food in any case, so I was perhaps more fortunate than my fellow prisoners. We were let out of our cell from 7 in the morning until 11 o'clock for exercise and to work, either at weaving fishnets or at cleaning cane ready for basket making. Then we were locked up again until 1 o'clock, and we were finally locked up for the night at 4 p.m. after our evening meal. All our meals were eaten in our cell, which probably added to the unpleasantness of the food. It was of course forbidden for me to have a pen and pencil or to have any newspapers ready to read, and my greatest anxiety at that time was how the party was faring during my absence. It was permitted to write one letter per month to one's parents or near relatives, but as a warder was always standing over your shoulder, your letter had to be censored by the prison authorities, so there was little apart from a flourishing account of one's health that would have got through. Fortunately, just before I was locked up, I was able to have a few valuable minutes with Bedema, who, having served his prison sentence for publishing false news, was preparing to leave. In those few minutes, I committed to his charge the full responsibility of running the evening news and the party. "I'll do my utmost to keep in touch with you somehow," I whispered to him, though goodness knows how. There was, I realized, only one way that I could keep in touch with the party outside the whitewashed walls: by writing. My whole life then centered around the problem of how to get a hold of a pencil and a supply of paper. Before long I managed to pick up a mere stump of pencil, which I kept safely hidden inside the band of my trouser tops. The paper looked like being a major problem until I suddenly saw the answer staring me in the face. Each day we were given a few sheets of toilet paper. I got the bright idea of appropriating these, as many as I could get. I don't know what the other prisoners must have thought was wrong with me when I made known to them my urgent need of additional toilet paper, but they were quite willing to exchange what they could spare for bits of food and anything else I could offer them. This precious store of paper was kept carefully under my straw sleeping mat. As soon as it was dark and we were thought to be asleep, like the many cockroaches that roamed freely about the cell, I too started to work. Writing in that cell was no easy matter, for the only light was from an electrical street lamp that penetrated through the bars at the top of the wall of the cell and cast its reflection on a part of the floor and a section of the opposite wall. I used to lie in this patch of light and write for as long as I could, until cramp made it unendurable. Then I would change it into a standing position and use the spot of light on the wall. On one occasion I remember covering 50 sheets of this toilet paper with my scribble. The written sheets were then folded minutely and wrapped in another piece of toilet paper, and this eventually found its way to Bedema outside. How they got there is quite another matter, but by the same means that my toilet paper scribbles found their way out of gaol, so Bedema was able to send me from time to time a full report of what was going on outside. It was no easy task for Bedema to keep the party united, and it was especially difficult when so many of the members were vying with each other for leadership. By reading out my messages from prison, however, Bedema managed to keep my name alive in the minds of the people and encourage them to carry on their struggle under his guidance until the day that I would once more be able to lead them. Once or twice a week I could hear evidence of the success of this, for crowds used to assemble outside the prison and sing party songs and hymns. One thing that I particularly remember was Kwame Nkrumah's body lies a mouldering in the cell, to the tune of John Brown's body. It boosted up my morale a great deal to hear these voices and to know that I had not been deserted and forgotten. I decided to grow a beard after discovering that we were expected to share one razor blade and one shaving stick among us. Although I was rapidly learning that the sooner I lost my self-respect, the sooner I would settle down in my uncomfortable and unsavory surroundings, I could never get used to the idea of a communal razor blade and shaving soap. I preferred letting my whiskers grow to running this risk of skin infection. I used to look forward most eagerly to Sundays as we were excused our usual labours on that day, and after washing my prison clothes, I used to search for a quiet corner in the prison yard where I could sit and reflect. One Sunday morning, I gathered my fellow party prisoners together and we organized a committee, of which I was the chairman, in order to work out the plans which the party outside were to follow. At the same time, we elected two subcommittees, one composed of the ex-servicemen and the other with Kojo Botsio as its chairman. We met regularly thereafter and discussed our common problems. This was unknown to the warders. On Sundays, also, we were allowed to attend whatever service was being conducted in the prison, the most popular of which was that of the apostolic faith. During this particular service, there was much clapping of hands and movement. Every prisoner, old and young, Christian and atheist, was glad to join in this service. In fact, we looked forward to it, for we managed to get not only fresh air but also exercise and relaxation from boredom. Some of the prisoners got so carried away during the service that they shed tears like children as they reflected and confessed their past misdeeds, begging for remission of their sins. In fact, some of them who confessed their sins were so repentant that when they were released they vowed they would never commit a crime again. But in spite of these good intentions, I used to notice that in a matter of weeks the same men were back again for the same crimes. After about a month or two, the hardship and the hardship and the monotony of prison life began to get the better of some of us, and we started quarreling and blaming one another for what had happened. Some of them couldn't understand why we should be forced to suffer, and quite a fracas ensued. Many times I had to act as a mediator and often had to beg and plead with my companions to keep peace and order within the confines of our small prison cell. This feeling of general unrest and discomfort brought out feelings of bitterness, selfishness, and revenge. I remember how on one occasion I had managed to get a hold of a copy of the evening news. As soon as we had been locked into our cell, one of our number became so embittered when he saw me reading this precious paper that he reported the whole thing to one of the warders. A search was made of our entire cell, and the newspaper was run to ground and confiscated. I was so relieved that my stump of pencil had not been found and that the sheets of toilet paper were unsuspected of playing a duplicate role, that I gladly accepted my punishment of short rations. The normal rations were barely adequate to keep body and soul together, and any reduction in this amount was certainly no joke, but I stuck it out. Apart from the Sunday service, there were two things that supplied a little relief to the boredom. One was an occasional concert that the prisoners used to get up, which, in spite of the crudeness of the performance, was, compared with the dark walls of the cell, grand entertainment. The other pastime that we enjoyed was gambling. There were 3 items of value in the prison: toilet paper, nut kernels, and soap. These things were so precious and so in demand that they always represented the stakes in our gambling games, for money was quite useless to us. I became a keen gambler as far as the toilet paper was concerned, because I could never get enough of this to write all I had to say. The nut kernel was generally used by the prisoners to oil their bodies because on account of the rotten diet and the poor quality of the soap, their skin became scaled and cracked. By chewing the nut kernel and then smearing your body with it, it was possible to get enough oil to lubricate the most affected parts of your skin, at least. The most demoralizing moments that I experienced in prison were when a prisoner was committed to be hanged. These unfortunate men were brought in chains and were kept in solitary confinement away from the ordinary prisoners. We all knew when the day of execution arrived, for we were made to get up earlier than usual and taken from our cell to an upstairs room where we were locked in before 6 o'clock. Some people used to try and peep through the window to see if they could catch a glimpse of what was going on, but it was quite impossible. By about 10 o'clock, we were let out, and the only sign of the grim event was that there was sometimes an occasional blood stain on the ground near where we went to have our ablutions, for the gallows was situated in the vicinity of the washroom. To see a man brought in one day and disappear completely a few days later was something that really affected the other prisoners. There must have been on average one execution a month during the time I was prisoned, and most of these men were hanged for killing their wives or for killing men who they had believed were having illicit relations with their wives. I used to reflect after these awful moments, and I wondered whether prison punishments really did achieve their purpose in reforming the criminal and whether capital punishment was a solution to murder cases. Criminals, after all, are human beings. No one is born a criminal. Society makes him so. And the only way to change things is to change the social conditions. It is only from the social standpoint that crime and punishment can effectively be approached. I have always been against the death penalty, even before I came so close to understanding what this meant during my prison life. I believe that it is a relic of barbarism and savagery, and that it is inconsistent with decent morals and the teaching of Christian ethics. The aim of punishment should be that of understanding and correction. I look back on my own boyhood. I was brought up in a particularly primitive society, but during the whole of my 18 years or so of boyhood life in Nzima, I can only remember there being one murder case, and that was a case in which a sexual maniac was involved. The taboos of primitive society generally curb crime. The impact of Western culture on the African mind brought in its train as much bad as good. Offences like forgery, bribery, and corruption, for instance, were practically unknown in our early society. My experience of 14 months in prison convinced me, moreover, that in a very short time prisoners lose all their individualism and personality. They become a set type in an unhappy world of their own. They lose confidence in themselves and are so unequipped to meet the outside world that it is little wonder that they hanker for the misery and boredom of their prison cell, a protective shelter for their lost and shattered souls. Although I suffered extreme boredom, I was luckily far too actively engaged in planning for the party outside to allow myself to become stagnant. Very soon the time approached for the general election, which was due to take place on the 8th of February 1951. There was much work to be done for this, for it was vital that our party won a majority in the new Legislative Assembly. I had already made it clear to the party organizers outside that by all means they should contest every seat in the election, and I had retrieved word from Bedimer that they had prepared themselves to do this. It had not been my original intention to stand for election myself, until I realized that unless I did, it might be very difficult to obtain my release before my sentence ended, for I knew that if I succeeded in winning the election, it would be very difficult for the authorities to insist on keeping me in prison. The first thing I did was to insist on my name being registered on the electoral roll. I experienced much opposition over this, but I was adamant, and as I was within the law in this respect, Nobody could forbid it, even though I did not expect to be able to use my vote. Few people realize that by our law, anyone who is convicted to a term of imprisonment not exceeding 1 year is entitled to be registered on the electoral roll. Although my total sentence was for a period of 3 years, this was made up of 3 separate terms of imprisonment of 1 year each. After battling to get my name on the electoral roll, I went to the prison authorities and told them that I had decided to stand for election. It was no good their trying to tell me that I was not qualified to do so, for the fact that I had been qualified to register as an elector ruled this out. Strange to say, some of the party members outside protested about my decision to stand election, for they held that if I was later disqualified, we would lose the seat altogether. But I waived all this inside. I told them that I would stand for Accra Central in place of Bedema, who agreed to stand election in Keta. The sudden change made the organization somewhat difficult, but we were able to overcome it. Acting officially through the prison superintendent, I arranged for those outside to pay my deposit, to sign my papers, and to form themselves into a campaign committee. My forms were completed and submitted to the authorities a few minutes before the registration period closed, and the campaign committee got to work on my behalf. I busied myself in rewriting the party manifesto, as the one that had been smuggled into me was not a manifesto in the true sense of the word. In due course I completed it. As soon as it became known that I was going to stand for election, there was a terrific jubilation throughout the country, for there was a general feeling that if I was elected, the government would, on the strength of it, release me and my colleagues. On the night of the general election, extra precautions were taken by the prison authorities owing to a rumour that had circulated that the whole of Accra was going to advance on the prison and get me out. However, it was all quiet, but I was unable to get some sleep the whole night. I was both very excited and anxious. I began to wonder whether everything would now prove to have been in vain, whether the people would still stand by the party and give me the chance to finish the job. Deep down in my heart, however, I knew that my hour of victory was at hand. I had complete trust and confidence in my people, and I knew that they would not let me down. The prison superintendent had arranged for hourly reports to be given to me on the progress of the election results. At around 4 in the morning, the news was brought to me that I had been elected for Accra Central. Not only that, but I had received the largest individual poll so far recorded in the history of the Gold Coast, 22,780 votes out of a possible 23,122. I had no time for reflection, for the news flashed around the prison, and in a matter of seconds the place was alive with jubilation. I believe even the warders were happy. Throughout Accra, the excitement of the crowds was so great that Bedema had the greatest difficulty in stopping a crowd of hundreds strong advancing on James Fort, where they intended to break down the doors and rescue me from my prison cell. Such an act, although done in good faith, would naturally have ruined all our chances of success. As the day wore on, and the true significance of all that had happened became clearer in my mind, my feelings became a mixture of humility, of gratefulness to the people, and of peace. A peace of mind, in fact, that I had long forgotten existed. I was brought back to earth by a message that was brought to me saying that there were a number of foreign newspaper reporters clamoring for a statement from me. I promptly refused to have anything to do with them, for I had long since discovered that such people rarely report you verbatim. They give their own interpretations, and the more lurid and sensational that they can make these, the better they like it. The day after the election results were announced, the executive committee of the CPP asked the governor if he would receive a delegation of the committee in order to discuss the question of my release, for they held that as leader of the party, if that party was asked to form a government, it would be impossible for me to do so while in prison. The governor agreed to meet this delegation, and after the meeting, arrangements were put in hand for my release. All this was done in complete secrecy, as the government did not want the news of my release to be spread abroad. Between 11 and 12 o'clock on the morning of the 12th of February 1951, the prison superintendent sent for me and told me to be ready to leave the gaol within the next hour. I looked around me, but the only possessions I had were my bit of pencil and a few sheets of toilet paper, and these no longer seemed valuable. I told him that I was ready to leave at a moment's notice. At about the same time, apparently, the news of my release leaked out in the town. At 1 o'clock, when the prison gates were closed behind me, I realized why the government had tried to keep the news top secret. I don't think I have ever seen such a thickly packed crowd in the whole of my life. I was too bewildered to do anything but to stand and stare. Any emotion that I might have felt was completely arrested. Then I remember a familiar voice speaking my name, and I woke from my trance to find Bedama standing by my side. We greeted each other, and my senses came to life as I was hoisted shoulder high and carried on to an open car that was standing nearby. It is difficult even now to describe all I experienced as this car moved at a snail's pace, like a ship being dragged by an overpowering current in a sea of upturned faces. To look at this locked mess of struggling figures and to listen to the deafening clamor of their jubilant voices made me feel quite giddy. The only way I could steady myself was to keep my eyes averted and to gaze at the mighty expanse of sea and sky until I was able to adjust myself and to acknowledge the greetings of the people. Slowly, as I filled my lungs with the pure air of freedom, new life was born into me. This was the greatest day of my life, my day of victory, and these were my warriors. No general could have felt more proud of his army, and no soldiers could have shown greater affection for their leader. From James Fort, the procession made itself to the arena, taking 2 hours to do so in what is normally a 15 minutes journey. At the arena, the birthplace of my party, the customary expiation was performed by sacrificing a sheep and by stepping with my bare feet in its blood 7 times, which was supposed to clean me from the contamination of the prison. The crowd stayed with me the whole time, accompanying me in the procession to the party headquarters, where, completely worn out, both physically and mentally, I crumpled into the nearest chair.